when we're introducing agents, we are introducing these entities or additional identities within ecosystems. As you increase autonomy, we'll have more and more human-like access, like in multiple systems. And if we say these two things together, right, the agent can access things the way that a human might in the same scenario or under the same conditions, and then that agent gets compromised, then it could very easily be used to cause outsized damage because it can move at the speed of machine. If you are running an enterprise of any size at all, you're going to be or have already begun deploying agents within different business units, and you need to get observability on that, what they're doing, where they're doing it, start assigning ownership. So if you're a CISO today and you don't feel like you have a good handle on your machine identity or non-human identity management posture, right, that picture, then you need to get a handle on it soon, because that is going to either enable you to roll out agents safely and have a kill switch for all of them if you need to. If you're moving from data to networking, and then you're moving from network to email systems, or you're looking at endpoint, or you're looking at mobile, or there's all these different things to learn. You kind of have to start over a few times. But if you learn a lot about all of these different systems, then you start to see overlaps quite often. And I think that that's really useful if you're going to be somebody that is going to be a thought leader, researcher, or writer on emerging trends. One, you can say to yourself based on that experience, oh, I've seen something like this before. It looks like an extension of that, right? So you have your own sort of filter there.
Hi, everyone. Today we have a very special guest, Alfredo Ramirez, who's a Senior Director Analyst at Gartner. I first met Alfredo when we were speaking about a couple of very interesting topics. And I found that, the way that he looked at new and emerging markets were very exciting, and thought he was one of the best people we could have as a first guest on the Analyst series. Alfredo covers a bunch of emerging technologies, including agentic AI, cybersecurity, identity security, and his work has helped technology providers as well as security leaders to understand where the market is heading and how to position themselves for what's coming next. I'm really excited to have you here, Alfredo. Welcome to the Be Fearless podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Alfredo, I'd love to start to, understand a little bit more and have a bit of an introduction of yourself. Tell us a bit more about your career journey and how you ended up being an analyst at Gartner.
Yeah, it's been, I think most folks that land at Gartner, have a pretty storied past and have been involved in technology a bunch of different ways. I've been in cybersecurity and technology for the last 22 years. I started at, right out of high school at a place called Rackspace. It was a big, host and colo host, where I, feel like I grew up in technology, and I had my hands on everything from answering the phones initially to power cycling servers. And then I got into backup and email systems administration, and eventually, was working my way towards network operations and network security, because that's where I thought all the coolest people were, right? All the smartest, coolest people were in security and network security at that particular place. So I worked my way over there to get my CCNA and all those things. So I spent about 14 years there doing all sorts of things, hands-on keyboard, fixing systems, designing systems, architecting systems, et cetera. And after that, I landed over at SailPoint. They're an identity governance administration vendor, doing competitive intelligence for them in that space and the adjacents. So got really exposed to the identity world, identity verification, PAM, a lot of the other components of security there. Got into product, and then eventually was running a product line there at SailPoint. At about that point, I guess I was 19 or almost 20 years into the business, having touched everything from services to software and product, go to market, et cetera. And found an opening at Gartner that was, had need for essentially all those skills that I had put together. It needed to have background in identity. It needed to have background in zero trust to be able to cover some networking and other components like that. So emerging technologies where I sit is rather broad. So they're looking for folks that have a broad background. And that's how I landed at Gartner. I've been here a little over a year and a half now.
No, that's amazing. I think, being able to combine that practical experience and, your experience of looking at larger markets, I feel like that's a very rare combination. And I can see why you provide really valuable insights to the emerging markets team. And speaking of that, I feel like you have probably one of the most interesting expertise looking at the newest technologies. What's your process in deciding what's the next big thing to cover?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways that might happen, right? So, I guess its first start is kind of like most people don't know that emerging technologies and trends exist. We call ourselves ETT within Gartner. The group itself has only been around for about 5 or 6 years. And the concept was to be able to, Gartner became a very large organization over the years. And to be more agile, we spun out this ETT group to focus on those items that maybe the rest of Gartner proper was not, set up to cover. They're more set up to cover mature markets, right? So emerging trends initially looked at patent filings. It looked at, where investments are being made in companies and startups or on the VC side. And we were taking those inputs in addition to other coverages, right? So things that were lesser touched or more niche from the other areas that Gartner covers, and started to put together coverage on those sort of missing components. So initially it was around what sort of data can we get around patent filings and where academia is going, where is investment money going, and that sort of drove these note types or document types around funded startups, things of that nature. And following those items has led us to a lot of the emerging trends that we cover now. So that's primarily where it starts. And then the vast majority of us have pretty large networks ourselves and are keeping tabs on a lot of different merging and adjacent areas.
No, that makes sense. I mean, another follow-up question I had on that, coming from VC, I also understand that a lot of things that are being invested and to some extent, even patents being filed, there's a lot of hype cycle that goes through it, right? Like, I know that's a Gartner term, but in general, there's a lot of, let's say, interest in, let's say, AI applications for a while. There will be certain a couple months where people are investing in certain things and it just completely disappears because the LLM suddenly came out with, certain new improvements. How do you then go ahead and separate genuine innovation from hype, especially in cyber when there's so much noise?
Yeah, a couple of things there, right? I mean, in the one instance, I mentioned how we go looking like you have in your past in VC. We're at a position in the market where we can highlight trends and technologies, and we're not like a VC that's making bets. Like you all are having to make bets and then follow those things if you were in that world, or within the startup world, you're making R&D bets, right? You're having to invest in coming to market with these things. We're monitoring, writing on them against what we see, and the markets and clients that we talk with either confirm or disprove the hype, right? So in that sense, I'm not going to say it's easy necessarily, but we have a mechanism for that confirmation. And we'll be writing against multiple topics. Some will start to generate additional interest, and some will start to fall to the wayside. We let that happen, right? We're not going to prop up anything that is not actually gaining any traction. So we try to focus our attention on things that seem as real as we can ascertain, right, with all of our collective background. And as they drop off, we'll notate that and let it kind of go. And that's how we tend to continue to move forward.
Yeah, and I suppose the beauty of Gartner is you don't just have access to vendors and investors, but also the actual practitioners who are later going to implement this. So I think it's always interesting to marry that together when it comes to adoption. One thing that I'm curious of, given emerging technology, it's always a new space, right? So what is the biggest challenge in covering technologies there?
Yeah, one of the things that seems to come up, right, is when we start to uncover things, it's sort of answering the question of, is this new or not? Or is this something under a different name? Or have we covered this before and have publications on this? It's sort of like checking through the back catalog of Gartner repository of published knowledge, which is massive, right? And ensuring like, did somebody else already touch on this and it's being renamed or it's being moved? That has come up more than once when I've been covering things. And it sort of brings things like you think you have something that is really interesting and new, and it's like, oh, that's really an extension of this other item. So then you cover it that way. You bring in the analysts that already have expertise, and instead of it being brand new, maybe you say, okay, this is additive. Take a look at this. So I think the one thing is that like you may think that you stumbled across, it's kind of like panning for gold. Oh, I think it's real, but it's not. And then you kind of have to walk that excitement back, I guess, from a personal analyst perspective. But from a larger market perspective, that's, of course, the right thing to do. You don't want to be writing about things that aren't that interesting. And then when something degrades, right? Like something has a lot of hype and then it's suddenly kind of falls off, or it's retreating, or it's no longer of interest to the market or investment. Perfect example, which is something I didn't cover, but folks in my group had covered and talked to me about a lot, was the whole metaverse thing, right?
Yeah.
Blew up. There's all this writing about it. What is it going to be? It's going to change the way everybody works, et cetera. You put out all this information about the best information you can compile around it. And who's talking about metaverse right now? Like no one, right? So those are sort of the, I guess, trials and tribulations of covering emerging, because even if you're right about, like I said earlier, you tested something against the market and for a while it was seeming like there was a there. It eventually fell off. So that work is, no longer being used and things of that nature. I think it's a unique emerging.
You're absolutely right. I think sometimes even things that are dead comes back as well, right? We covered enterprise browsers a lot, but these are not the first generation. You've had Chromium in the past, so it's really interesting that sometimes it gets framed as an emerging technology, but really it's just history repeating itself. But I really want to get into your research. I know you published a very interesting piece in September on agentic AI and how it's being adopted. You shared there that 17% of enterprises already deployed AI agents and around 42% have plans to deploy it in the next 12 months. Can you share a little more about that research and where you're seeing the most agentic AI adoption?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, and I was happy to be a part of that. So ETT, again, that this portion of Gartner, we conduct these projects called CBRs. So it's case-based research, right? Where we take essentially a sampling of questions. They look like a survey, but we don't hand them out as a survey. We actually interview vendors that are in these particular spaces. This came from an agentic AI CBR exercise that spanned the whole first quarter of the year, a little bit over actually, to meet with just under 30 different vendors. And you have to schedule out 2 hours on both sides. It's a big undertaking to get all those numbers together. And that's where we kind of tease out all of that information, right? So we were talking to vendors that were bringing agents to market in all different areas: cybersecurity, more generally, business process automation, any sort of niche or non-niche that you could think about, and from hyperscalers down to earlier startups, right? And those numbers kind of bared out across those reactions that we were collecting. Those adoption numbers, right? We're seeing those, you mentioned 17% already deployed agents, and then 42% with plans to deploy. Also, those are strengthened through some formal surveys that we took that show slightly different numbers, but are mostly akin there. So the concept there is we reach out to a bunch of vendors, we meet with them for over 2 hours over a couple of weeks, ask all of these questions, aggregate the answers, and then pull out the threads that seem to be of interest there. That's how the research goes, and I'll be participating in it again next year along with some other teams in areas like AI agents, domain-specific language models, things of that nature.
That's awesome. I'm really curious to see how that number will change when you do it again next year. But one of the really interesting concepts that you guys introduced was this concept called agent washing. Can you elaborate a bit more on what you meant by this?
Yeah, and this has been sort of a concept that I guess Gartner analysts in general sort of have been talking through, right? The concept of agent washing is I apply the term agent, right, to a system or automation that is not really what we would define or consider an agent or agentic, right? Or it's applied to a system that maybe is just an extension of automation with an LLM or something of that nature. either just adjacent to something that already existed, or we brought it to market, but it doesn't really have any agency, right? Like it can't actually be given a set of tasks or purposes, a purpose and goal that it can autonomously plan for, react to, sense from its environment, and then take action on. If it's not doing those things, and it's really more of a step automation or linear automation with LLMs involved, we would not consider that latter situation an agent, although it's being applied in the market as an agent.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really good point, because I think when we're evaluating a lot of companies back in investing as well, you see a lot of these companies that are branding what they do as agentic AI. But really, there's still a lot of human in the loop. And maybe that's okay. For certain use cases, especially in healthcare and more sensitive industries, it's probably good to have a human in the loop. But you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of hype on, misuse of these terminologies. So I'm really glad that you guys brought it up. I know that you guys also briefly talked about the importance of having guardrails with these AI agents, because that's probably the reason why there still needs to be some human in the loop, right? But how do you think the risks posed by agentic AI are different from regular AI chatbots, especially as they do become more autonomous?
Yeah, that's exactly sort of it, right? Is that the blast radius would be equitable to a person and whatever their access is within a system if their identity were compromised, right? Which, what we know from the past, more recent years is that attacking identities of people is advantageous and more valuable for attackers in general, because they can get to what they want quicker. If that is a ransomware outcome, or if that is simply I have access to systems to exfiltrate data or to transfer money, then it's much quicker to attack an identity in those cases. And when we're introducing agents, right, we are introducing these entities or additional identities within ecosystems that will have, as you increase autonomy, will have more and more human-like access, like in a multiple system scenario. And if we say these two things together, right, the agent can access things the way that a human might in the same scenario or under the same conditions, and then that agent gets compromised, then it could very easily be used to cause outsized damage, because it can move at the speed of machine and at machine scale, right? Hence those guardrails that need to be imposed around the both the probabilistic and deterministic portions of the agent construction, right? So when I think about that, I think about, static policy to check what's going in and out of this system and what it's trying to do based on static permissioning. And then this other concept around probabilistic guardrails, which could be a number of different things. If we're just looking at ins and outs of a model, it could be another model that has a different prompt or context to check the outputs of the first model, or it could be an entire agent whose job is to autonomously be checking the actions and outputs of other agents. And Gartner refers to that or defined that as a guardian agent pattern. So both of those are forms of guardrails that are very quickly gaining in importance in terms of how you architect and implement an agentic system to have sort of checks and balances that will be able to occur at the speed and scale that those agents can act. Obviously, if you had all those checks going through human in the loop, there'd be far too many actions and inputs and outputs for a human to check, right? So that's where that goes.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, because I think ever since I stepped my foot in cyber, people have always been saying employees are the weakest link. But now we have a new weak link, which is the AI agents, right? So that's been really interesting. One of the things that you mentioned in the report as well is the fact that one of the main use cases of AI agents is in knowledge management. How do you think this changes the way security leaders are thinking about DLP?
I like this one a lot in terms of a thought process. Whenever folks have been putting in front of me, what do I need to be concerned about when I'm implementing agents into my ecosystem, I think about two sides of the agent, one around the model being used, right? The sort of brain of this agent, and then where that sits. So you have sort of model security, and then you have application security around where the actual systems are. And then the identity and access management component of what it's going to do. But in terms of the knowledge management, it is now no longer just a data access governance concern, right? In terms of if the agent has access to these particular systems or these flat files or these data sets, then we need to know what's in there, whether or not there's PII, who else has access to it. That's just a sort of a static data access governance model. Mm-hmm. But these, when you introduce the LLM portion or the model portion, it can now produce knowledge that doesn't pre-exist, right, from the data inputs that it has access to that might be different and separate than the knowledge that could be produced by a human with the exact same data access, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that part gets really dicey really quick, and only a few groups are really looking at what that means and how we can assess whether or not the answers that this thing is coming up with should be shared back to the requester, whoever the requester is, a human, agent, or et cetera, based on the answer that was produced and not just the role-based access or attribute-based access of the requester or those same items of the agent system itself. And that part gets really complex around how are we going to define need to know of knowledge, and at points, right, do we decide that should be withheld or modified before it's released back out to the requester?
Yeah, like what is the source of truth, right? Which is a really interesting question. How are you thinking about AI browsers like Comet? Do you think they will be widely adopted? What are the security implications that come with them?
Initially, when I heard about like a Comet, right, or any sort of AI-based browser, built-in, I guess, AI componentry within the browser system, I thought it was really cool, and I thought that it would have a really strong uptick. Personally, I didn't write on any of this. I didn't do hard research on it, but I was just kind of in the back of my mind. I was thinking, that sounds really interesting. I think the uptake from consumers might be pretty large. What I've seen so far is not so much, right? I think maybe for the same reasons that there is trouble with uptake of like a full-on enterprise browser versus a plugin framework is it's hard to change people's habits, right? Yeah. Even if it's just available to me, it's like, that's really neat, but I'm probably not just going to switch over to doing all my work in it tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And further to that point, I still haven't found a ton of time to mess around with any of them. I'd love to test them out some more, but I've got my workflow and things of that nature. It, of course, introduces problems, a lot of heartburn for any security-minded person to have AI with some, computer vision, OCR involved on your browser screen with what you're seeing at all times. That's a concern. That makes me concerned. And I think it makes any CISO in the world concerned right away. So that right away raises some flags that I think that would probably dampen the adoption. And we'll see where it goes. I just haven't seen a ton of movement around the AI browser thing just yet. That doesn't mean it's not going to take off.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because, I wrote a book about the browser wars earlier this year, and this is kind of the second generation of browser wars, right? But I think it's interesting because at least my personal bet is with Chrome and Edge. I mean, Chrome released Gemini and Chrome and all things like that. I feel like AI browser might be the norm in the future, but it may come in the form of consumer browsers becoming more AI powered rather than dedicated AI browsers. And I think the security aspect is definitely something that's a very interesting topic right now. We published a research last week on how Comet can be fooled to, providing OAuth access to a bunch of enterprise apps. I think it's been a big conversation with a lot of CISOs that we meet. The other interesting area of research that you do is, on disinformation, identity security. I'm really curious what got you into this space. I must admit, this is an area that I never fully was able to wrap my head around and how the security products work there. So I'd really love to understand, from your perspective, what are some of the major challenges in this space?
Yeah, so this has been a really interesting undertaking for me. So I came to Gartner for my backgrounds in the backgrounds that I mentioned to you to include identity sort of at the forefront. So I needed some identity expertise. And disinformation security was defined by Gartner in 2024, towards the end of 24, as a bucket of technologies that would aid with the goals of deepfake detection, impersonation prevention, sort of writ large, and reputation protection when we're talking about, governmental entities or enterprises with large brands to protect and et cetera. It's kind of evolved since then to more around this concept of narrative intelligence, what's being said about people and organizations, where and by whom, and whether or not that's malicious or not, and et cetera. But I think what really brought it to the fore is, or what's the most interesting about it, is that one, the goals of disinformation have not really changed throughout history. It's propaganda, right? It's information warfare is the goal of most disinformation or fraud, typically, right? So I either want to change hearts and minds, or I want to steal something or access money or et cetera. And to do that, I'm going to seed various areas with my version of the truth, or show you something that is outright fraudulent or synthetic, or that is partially synthetic, right? Like I might just modify part of a video or part of a picture to get across what it is that I'm trying to make real for my audience. So it wasn't really part of security until we defined it that way. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One being that it was being used, with the advent of generative AI, right? It made the generation of disinformation of all types, text, video, media, much easier, right? And so now you have the same actors or types of actors that can now scale their operations to much larger cohorts, change as needed, right? And misrepresent in almost any language, anywhere in the world at any time, right? So I think that it really amplified the scale and the reach of those that wanted to disinform or to, commit various sorts of impersonation and fraud. Hence, it's starting to touch a much broader group of individuals and enterprises and governments. And we knew it was time that this started to move over into the overlap of cybersecurity, right? Because cybersecurity folks are the ones that typically handle things like access problems or inform, leadership around needs for executive protection and things of that nature. So that's kind of where that came from. Obviously, with an identity background and the impersonation piece, there was overlaps there as well. It was really generative AI maturing into what it's become so far that spurred this along and really lit a fire under it.
Yeah, I think deepfake is really interesting, right? These GAN models that have two competing neural networks, like the generator and discriminator network. And it's almost the fact that, the security products not only have to beat the generator network, but have to be better than the model itself's discriminator network. I know like a lot of the early technologies looks at things like, eyes or whatever that these AI don't do very well, but a lot of that has been improved, and almost like the better the detection technologies are, the faster these kind of generator technology also develops. What are some of the more interesting approaches you've seen when it comes to deepfake detection?
Yeah. So some of these groups have really been taking a look at, for instance, to your point, right, you can't just look at a particular area if we're talking about humans, right? So first of all, deepfake doesn't just cover humans. It might be trying to show a hospital that was exploded when it's not exploded, or something of that nature, or it might be just voice. It might not have an image at all, right? So then there are groups now that are focusing on audio deepfake detection, folks that have focused on the visual deepfake detection. And typically now the visual folks are now working on or have rolled out streaming video. So you don't have to like batch upload something to a system to check it or whatever. You can do it live, like on a call, like we would be doing now, or something of that nature. And what has also come out of getting over to the more interesting parts around that, it's like, of course, all of that is very difficult to do, and it is very difficult to stay on top of. And there's no worldwide or even nationwide benchmark for comparing these solutions, which is really difficult right now. It's like, we're 98%, effective. Well, based on what? Our own data. And it's kind of like, well, okay, we need something better than that. And the market has not, and governments have not responded on that one just yet. I'm hoping that we will. But one of the items that I have been speaking with some groups about recently that I think is really interesting is that when you are introducing something like evidence within a legal context, right? And then it gets challenged, which is slowly starting to happen. And I think it's going to take off. I mean, the very first defense of any sort of video or audio is going to be, that's not me. Prove it, kind of thing. And so now there is this ask for, okay, if you're going to show me, say that this is synthetic or partially synthetic, can you tell me what parts of it are synthetic in which frames, right? So that's a really difficult problem to solve for, as I understand it. Now, there are much smarter people than me working on this, but what I understand is that most groups have been approaching this by showing you basically an attention heat map, right? Mm-hmm. So it could show you what the model was focusing on to try to come to its determination. Not super useful, but it looks cool and go to market, right? It'll show like, oh, here's the heat map of the face. Well, that's what the model was looking at to try to make its determination, but that's not necessarily what is synthetic or not. We're not telling you that because that's not what this would tell you. It just tells you attention. The other would be the actual detection at a pixel level, right? So if you break this image or this frame down by pixels, and you're looking at each individual pixel for some sort of synthetic content, some sort of synthetic indicator, then I can show you a heat map of what is actually synthetic and what might not be, or what might be real. And I've seen some demonstrations of this that I have not been able to confirm necessarily, but it seems like the better way forward. So those two things I think are important, and not something that is intuitive for somebody outside of that world to ask, right? What kind of heat map is this? Are you showing me attention, or are you showing me actual detection here from this model? So I think it's something important to share with you, with the viewers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose the other philosophy, some people are like, you know what, we won't win the detection race in the long run. So let's just use blockchain to, mark every single creation. That has its own deployment challenges, but I'm very curious to see where this lands in 30, 40 years. But, looking into the future a little bit, how do you think browser and identity security and even, all these kind of disinformation security will evolve in the future, especially as AI browsers and agentic AI become more widely adopted?
Yeah. So I already see the overlaps between a sort of a browser security and identity, right? Obviously, you're seeing as much as the enterprise would see from an IDP or from a directory on the identity and what it might be doing. And you're seeing even more, because in many cases, you're also being able to attach whatever personal accounts might be getting logged into by that user as well, and then say, okay, well, we know that's tied to this individual user. We'll keep that in mind moving forward. And if there's, data exfil trying to occur, then we can mark it and all those sorts of things. That's useful. So identity and browser security, no brainer, right? There should be more overlap there. And I think that the telemetry coming from browser security solutions should definitely be going to the IDPs and the ITDR solutions, so that you can take action on that telemetry that, maybe you need to take outside of what you might do in the browser. I'm not sure if that's necessary yet, but I have to think about that one. And then disinformation, of course, right? Because the browser, the same way, is our sort of window into the world and how we're making decisions and how we are business decisions, right? Like if you can't trust the information coming through that digital window, then how do we continue to function? So we have to get to a point, right, where there is an easy way to check media without having to go through a bunch of hoops to do it, right? Like I got to get the URL and paste it into a separate thing and all these sorts of things. It seems like it would be a natural integration to have that as part of your browser security, browser plugin to also check media, but maybe it's not exactly the same. Maybe it's two running. I'm not sure. But that's what I see. Overlaps with identity, of course. Disinformation should be, we're not there yet as a market, but I think we have to be.
Yeah, I'm even curious how, identity and disinformation could be integrated with each other, right? I think Okta is doing a great job with integrating, all bunch of different identity threat vectors. I know they used to be more identity access management, but with their shared signal framework, they can now take telemetry from different vendors to understand, okay, it looks like this account is compromised. Let's lock people out, which I think is significant improvement in moving identity towards security and not just access management. I'd love to learn a little bit more, Alfredo, on what you're working on. What other exciting work can we expect from you in the next 12 months?
Oh my goodness, we are going all over the place. So those areas that I am talking through, right, I feel like I started working on the agentic AI side, and this is both ways, right? So it's how do we secure the agents within ecosystems? And then how do we use agents for cybersecurity purposes, which is a whole other world of things that is really taking off with AI Security Operations Center, AI systems for identity and access management. So it's kind of, how do we secure agents? And we're going to use agents to secure ourselves and the agents. It gets really circular really fast. So definitely more on AI agents and where they're going, right? Because it was a little bit of near future tech. And what I'm seeing through all the POCs that were in motion for this year, a lot more deployment is going to start happening. And when you start to run into scale problems, I'm already seeing them, right? Like, let's say you can sell that solution that you've been trying to sell for agents. And then we say, great, we're going to buy it. Now let's roll it out across 1,000 agents on these 3 different systems and geographically disparate, all those sorts of things. The scale problems are going to be real, and we're going to feel some growing pains there. So I will likely be putting out what I can find in terms of best practice for that and what's not working. For disinformation, I talked to you about deepfake detection. I mentioned narrative intelligence and the impersonation prevention. Those things right now are point solutions that I think are starting to coalesce, right? Not right away, but slowly. And we are starting to form around this concept of, instead of saying deepfake detection and narrative intelligence, these things, a digital authenticity platform, right? Where I can keep, what is through this, embedded through this from incoming vectors is real, or it's not, but at least I know it's not. And it was created by Gemini, or it was created by whatever. So that's sort of a shield between what is real and not is where I see a lot of this going. Time will tell, and I'll be writing against that quite a bit. And identity, the loudest thing to me, and this is different depending on who you are, is the agentic identity. It is the fastest growing identity type, right? And it's not its own type. Right now, we define that as a subset of machine identity. Microsoft came out recently and said, hey, within Entra, we're going to define an agent ID, right? Like you can define something as an agent ID within Entra now, or at least they rolled out some level of that. I saw some publication on it. So, we don't sit with, Gartner is not taking that position yet. But what we know is it is vastly increasing the amount of machine identities, which by its nature increases your attack surface. These things will be utilizing browsers. There's the whole concept of agents as acting on behalf of consumers and things of that nature. I think that's going to be another big area of concern about how we register these agents, how we identify who their quote owner is, human owner, and what they're allowed to do on behalf of that owner.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really cool. I can't wait to read all of these research. But Alfredo, a lot of our audience are CISOs and security practitioners. What would you be your advice to them if they were to ask, what they should focus on when it comes to security investments in the next 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, good one there. On the two sides where I sit, right? I think the one that is most ubiquitous, we just mentioned, right? If you are running an enterprise of any size at all, you're going to be or have already begun deploying agents within different business units, and you need to get observability on that, what they're doing, where they're doing it, and start assigning ownership. So if you're a CISO today and you don't feel like you have a good handle on your machine identity or non-human identity management posture, right, that picture, then you need to get a handle on it soon, because that is going to either enable you to roll out agents safely and have a kill switch for all of them if you need to, right? Or inhibit you from rolling out agents safely, right? And I think that's top of mind for a lot of different groups. On the disinformation security side, I would say if you're a CISO and you have not talked at all with your chief comms officer or CMO about any sort of sentiment analysis or narrative intel that we're doing, you don't know where that sits, I'd at least get the conversation started, right? Everybody, I think this year was sort of thinking, well, I know that deepfakes are starting to happen. They're starting to be utilized to attack for different groups and identities, but what's the chance it's going to happen to me? Well, it's going to, because it's so easy. This is like early days spear phishing, right? Where I was like, wow, that sounded like a really well-written email. It didn't sound, riddled with errors and things. We were sort of in that era in 25. As soon as you can see how good these things can deepfake you or your leadership in with very little amounts of input data, then you get the realization of how scary this is, and we need to have a way of checking for our users. So top of mind for me would be those two thoughts, right? Like get a handle on the machine IAM side of things so that you can safely deploy agents in the near term or midterm. And secondarily, again, for me is you need to understand what disinformation is as a set of malicious technologies, what you can do about it with deepfake detection and narrative intelligence, and then how that might overlap with your comms or CMO.
Yeah, it sounds like that's a really great point. It sounds like because it's so new, first let's get the visibility ready and then let's decide what to do. Let's audit all the Gen AI agents that you're using, and then let's decide, what sort of policies we want to implement. We talked about AI a lot. We talked about identity security a lot. These are all critical security risks, but it's things that, people are at least somewhat aware, maybe not to the extent that we want them to be. But what are the emerging threats do you think should be on people's radar that aren't getting enough attention?
Oh my gosh. If you want to get a little bit out there, right, within the cyber physical system space, we talk a lot about cyber physical systems, electromagnetic warfare, right? So disabling things through electromagnetic fields and what that might mean for the convergence of cyber physical system security and utilities. If you don't work in that area, then maybe it's less interesting, but I think it's generally something that folks should get a little bit of background on. We, of course, have notes on it, but you can find other information on that. And then my thought, too, around, anyone involved in, I guess you could say, shipping, manufacturing, moving of goods, the vast majority of companies that are doing that sort of thing should be looking into something called Earth intelligence and what that means in terms of how it affects your business for dealing with disaster, with weather, with potential, other problems around the breakout of military advancements in warfare, straits being blocked. I mean, all these sorts of things. One of my skip level VPs says, if you should be interested in Earth intelligence if you do business anywhere on the Earth's surface or just above it. And I said, well, yeah, everybody, I suppose. So it's not my area of expertise, but I find it fascinating. It's sort of an overlap between what you can gather in terms of telemetry from low Earth orbit satellites back into cyber physical systems and what that means for supply lines, supply chains, movements of people and goods and services, et cetera, right? It might even be other things like disinformation, corporate espionage, and things of that nature that you could look out for, find out about, or have intelligence on through this concept of Earth intelligence. So that's one of these out there concepts that I think is really interesting that our team is working on.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think we're so focused on a digital space. We're so focused on all the threats, all the things that's happening there, but we forget that we're all vulnerable to the physical space, right? At least digital, you could, decide not to be on it, but, physical space, everyone's involved. And last question for you, Alfredo, if someone wanted to become a thought leader and an analyst like yourself, especially in the emerging technology space, what would be your advice for them?
Oh, wow. That's a good one. So, I would say this, it depends on where you are at in your career, right? But I think that sometimes people can get a little bit slowed down by saying, well, sort of a sunk cost fallacy, right? I spent the last 3 years in data backup, so I should probably continue and become a data backup engineer and then an engineer, architect, and then I'll just keep going down this very narrow path. And for some people that works. But if you want to cover emerging technologies, you don't always know what that's going to be, and you need to be able to move horizontally. So what I did along my career path, not intentionally, but if you wanted to be intentional about this, you could, was that after I spent 18 or 36 months in an area, and then there was an opportunity adjacent that I thought was interesting, I'd just go for it. And then it would kind of start me over because you have to start again. You have to learn over again. You got to learn a new set. If you're moving from data to networking, and then you're moving from network to email systems, or you're looking at endpoint, or you're looking at mobile, or there's all these different things to learn. You kind of have to start over a few times. But if you learn a lot about all of these different systems, then you start to see overlaps quite often, right? And I think that that's really useful if you're going to be somebody that is going to be a thought leader, researcher, or writer on emerging trends. One, you can say to yourself based on that experience, oh, I've seen something like this before. It looks like an extension of that, right? So you have your own sort of filter there. And then two, you can see overlapping patterns that often other folks don't, right? Like the concept of disinformation security and sharing signals to cybersecurity systems like SIMs and SOCs. Nobody was talking about. I published a paper on it and have been having that ongoing conversation with how that's going to happen. It happened, 6 months ago, and now we're having that conversation, and people are actually rolling this out because they saw the value of it. But it took somebody looking at these particular areas and seeing a missing piece to kind of make that connection. So if you want to understand connective tissue, you have to understand multiple systems. So that would be sort of my advice is, if it interests you to be broad, don't afraid to go broad because you feel like you're going to have to start over, or you feel like, well, I'm going to throw away all that I learned, because you never do. You end up using all of it again at every next place. You just get better, and it's additive and accretive rather than a full reset.
Yeah. And I guess you never know when it'll become helpful. So it's always good to have the bias for action. But Alfredo, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for being on the Be Fearless podcast. I absolutely learned a lot from you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Audrey, so much. I appreciate it.